Companies around the world are looking to make a difference by working toward the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But that comes with challenges, not the least of which is making sure that teams can measure both the impact they're aiming for and the stakeholder value their projects create. So today, let's look at how teams are using data-driven storytelling to show how their companies are achieving long-term success on social and environmental initiatives. In today's fast-paced and complex business landscape, project professionals lead the way, delivering value while tackling critical challenges and embracing innovative ways of working. On Projectified, we bring you insights from the project management community to help you thrive in this evolving world of work through real-world stories and strategies, inspiring you to advance your career and make a positive impact. This is Projectified. I'm Steve Hendershot. PMI's 2024 list of most influential projects is devoted to initiatives that address UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The list not only shows off the innovation, execution, and impact of these efforts, but also highlights how teams can demonstrate the efficacy of their impact through data and metrics. For social impact-minded projects to succeed long-term, quantifying their positive impact is essential. The metrics don't need to be financial, but they do need to demonstrate that real progress is being made toward reaching the SDGs. Today, we're going to talk to people leading two of those projects about how they measure their project's positive impact. And after you finish listening to this episode, check out all of the 2024 most influential projects. Visit pmi.org/podcast and click on the transcript for this episode. You'll find a link to the full list along with resources on social impact. Okay, on to the discussion. Karlijn Sibbel is the Innovation Director at Notpla in London, an organization dedicated to replacing traditional plastic products with alternatives made from materials including seaweed. The company is making impressive progress. To date, Notpla has replaced more than 17 million single-use plastic units with its natural and biodegradable packaging. Our other guest is Grzegorz Wach. He's the Refugee Employment Initiative Lead at nonprofit NESsT and joins us from Warsaw. The work he oversees is part of retail giant IKEA's larger efforts to support thousands of refugees and was launched by IKEA Social Entrepreneurship, NEST, and the Cisco Foundation. Through the program, NEST offers financial and business assistance to companies that provide refugees with long-term employment support, such as career training and quality job opportunities. Karlijn, Greg, thanks for joining us. I want to start by learning more about your projects, so let's begin with seaweed. Karlijn, tell us what you're doing at Notpla and your project's impact.
We're on a mission to make single-use plastic packaging disappear. And what we're trying to do is to match better the time that you're using a packaging for with how long actually the material that it's packaging is going to last. Like if you look at plastics, it's going to take hundreds of years to actually disappear or biodegrade. And you might use packaging only for a few minutes. We do that by making packaging from seaweed and plants. And we're using seaweed because it's one of the ocean superpowers. Some of the species can even grow up to 1 meter per day. We make all sorts of packaging, mainly for short-use applications like takeaway food containers. We make a paper barrier coating. We make flexible films, for example, for dishwasher tablets that can solubilize. We also make rigid materials such as ice cream spoons. And then we use different parts of the seaweed, mainly the polymers in the seaweed, to make these packaging applications. We want to use every part of the seaweed. So we also use some of the fibers that come from the seaweed to make ocean paper. Some of the SDGs that we're targeting are mainly around number 12, around sustainable consumption and production patterns. So really looking at like not developing harmful materials and replacing plastic. And of course, by using seaweed, we're looking at numbers 14 for life below water. So on one end, avoid the impact of plastics on our oceans, but also by using actually marine resources in a way that can actually benefit also ocean health and building that in sustainable ways.
Cool. I love the idea that part of the solution to healing the ocean of plastic comes from the ocean. How did you arrive at the specific applications or products to bring to market? Did that change over time as you began developing and testing? This is definitely an innovation director question.
when I was talking about making materials more aligned with how long you'll actually use a packaging, we were actually quite inspired by fruits and how fruit peels are almost the perfect way of packaging invented by nature. And then we started to look at materials that could be similar like that. And we started to look at spherification and that process that is used to make fake caviar. Rodrigo and Pierre, the co-founders of Notpla, they were at the Imperial University and they were playing around in the kitchen with this spherification and found a new way actually to package liquids. And that's how a flagship product was born called Oho, which is named after the sound that people make when they consume it because it's actually an edible water bubble. So we started to hand those out at the London Marathon to hydrate the runners. And then we started different partnerships. We started to work with Just Eat, which is a food delivery platform in the UK, but also in other parts of Europe. They came to us with this problem of like, oh, besides the ketchup sachets and condiment sachets, we also have a problem with our boxes because often when you have a paper packaging, actually, for it to be able to hold food, there needs to be a plastic coating on the inside. Could you use your seaweed technology for that as well? Very much like a collaborative approach with what people are asking for and what packaging problems they have and looking together at like what could be a solution and how can we use the superpowers of seaweed to address that.
That's great. Okay, Greg, we're turning it over to you. Tell us about the Refugee Employment Initiative.
NESsT generally is investing into creating quality jobs in Central Europe and also in South America already for over 25 years. The project that I'm honored to lead, the NESsT Refugee Employment Initiative, which aims to empower refugees and migrants to access quality jobs with stable income. This project started just after outbreak of full-scale war in Ukraine in mid-2022. Our long-term aim as the project to create between 2,000 and 3,000 quality jobs for refugees and migrants and improve the lives of at least 5,000 refugees by supporting social enterprises and other impactful companies to create those jobs. And as of mid this year, we are currently supporting 11 companies. During that time span, our portfolio already supported by skills development trainings over 4,600 excluded people, creating 1,900 jobs, out of which 815 are jobs for refugees. We are targeting social enterprises, so they are generally micro companies. Some of them are small ones, so having still limited capacity to create jobs internally, they are doing a lot of work in terms of reskilling, upskilling people, equipping them with capacities to help them access to decent jobs in the market. This dignified employment is a key thing for us, is our DNA, and that's the most important thing that we are tracking across this initiative, this project, but also across the others that we are running here in Central Europe or in the South America.
Okay, great. I heard a lot of end result metrics in there. I imagine there are probably also others you're using to quantify your incremental progress, like setting targets for people participating in trainings, receiving certifications, and so forth. What other metrics are you using to measure progress?
I tried to limit myself not to overwhelm you with all the numbers. Really, we are trying to measure a lot of things when it comes to the social impact. And all of this starts with the theory of change that we created and is driving all our efforts related to supporting job creation. What we are tracking are different dimensions that are included in job readiness, tracking number of people that are receiving wraparound services, which are, for example, but not limited to psychological, legal support, giving more access to affordable housing or helping vulnerable people children to access schooling on a primary level or to kindergartens. Then as a next level is the skills development training, which could be soft skills or hard skills, everything that could help people access jobs, including language courses, which are, especially for refugees, migrants, essential. And then as a next final step is tracking employment in 3 models that we have defined in our methodology. The first one is most straightforward, simply creating jobs, hiring people internally by the companies that we are supporting, which of course, as working with social enterprises has its limits. As a result, we are also encouraging and working with our companies to track their indirect impact, which comes with training and placement. So equipping people with skills, other support, which is job related, and then track to some extent whether they get a job thanks to this upskilling and monitoring conditions of this work, including salaries, etc. And last but not least, the third model is a supplier model one, which is not about getting a job, but about purchasing products or services from people with vulnerable background and giving them a dignified income for their products. We are also measuring gender equality when it comes to pay gaps. We are also measuring business performance of the companies that we are investing in and their environmental practices and impact in order to help them become more and more sustainable.
That was a great breakdown. Okay, Karlijn, let's turn to the metrics you're tracking. How did you decide how to measure your environmental and social impacts, and then how did you do it?
Metrics are really about how do we capture and how do we measure success, what does success look like for us, that we can replace as many single-use plastic items as possible. So that's really our core metric that we use. And we came to the unit specifically because we have so many different types of packaging and there's different weights. So it was, of course, thinking of like, oh, is it better to have a volume as your metric? But in our case, it makes much more sense to have a unit actually as our key metric. And then there's other ways of how we measure impact as well, using life cycle analysis and understanding of what actually the CO2 footprints are from the materials and solutions that we're developing, but also looking at end of life. So we want to make packaging disappear. So we need to make sure that wherever it ends up, if it's in recycling or if it's in different composting methods, or if it actually ends up by accident in the environment, that it doesn't cause any harm. So we do quite a lot of testing to see how does actually the material break down and making sure that it doesn't leave any harmful traces behind.
Units make sense then, because you're essentially saying that every unit that you put into the market, you are replacing one that doesn't biodegrade as well. So therefore there's an impact. The second one also seems really important, which is making sure that your products have the positive effect that you want. How did you figure out how to track that progress? Like, how did you arrive at those tests and so forth?
So it's something that we're continuously developing. There's some standardized processes that are being put into place of like how to do a life cycle assessment, for example, but it is kind of tricky sometimes. And especially for life cycle assessments, like we have different products at different stages of development. Looking at the footprint at like what the processing looks like is very different at a small scale than at a bigger scale. And the partners you might work with is very different. So it's continuously changing, but it's kind of like this hotspot analysis that we keep doing at different stages of a product's, I guess, growing up stages. In terms of end of life, that's quite a lot of different tests because you could think of a lot of different ways of where the packaging could end up. We're always targeting specific ones. So most of the time we want to at least make sure that it can be composted naturally. And there's different types of ways of composting. So one of the quick things that we do is we have a little wormery in our office. So that's the first thing that we test is like, do the worms eat it? Will it actually degrade? And what is the time frame in which that happens? But then there's also external testing that can be done, like hum composting tests. And then we send it to the lab and they come back with how quickly did it actually degrade and what did it degrade it into. We know that there are some limitations for these end-of-life verifications. There's not always to the standard as we would want them to be. So that's why we work quite hard on also setting up our own metrics and our own tests of what we think success in those cases would look like, and then work together with partners and different people to see how we can bring that to life outside of Notpla.
What have you found challenging in your particular contexts about measuring positive social or environmental impact on your projects? What is uniquely challenging about this compared to, traditional measurements when the wins and losses are in more conventional and financial terms?
There are two things that should be underlined here. One is, let's say, second model of creating jobs, which we are internally calling training and placement. I mean, there is a lot of challenges when it comes to tracking such impact, because we are including a third party here. People are receiving some kind of capacity building, skills development, and then they are either matched with employers by our portfolio company or are accessing decent jobs on their own using the background and skills that they were given. And then the whole challenge is to track this impact. I mean, to access qualitative and quantitative data and to be in contact with those people over extended period of time. So that's one thing, getting this data by our portfolio companies. And second thing is the scope that we have here in the Refugee Employment Initiative. So we are talking about addressing, of course, on a small, medium scale, but still migration crisis and all the uncertainty that comes with it, that the refugee waves, inflows are coming and going. People are temporarily at some region, then they are moving, and the whole geopolitical situation is changing. We right now entering the third year of this project are constantly adjusting our metrics related assumptions, the goals that we are designing together with our companies, and also the qualitative approach in terms of delivering training, in terms of sourcing also people. When I'm looking back and comparing this project with some of the others without the migration label, is really challenging, but on the other hand, we truly believe that is affecting the ecosystem and helping a lot the companies and also the other players to understand how to work within those constraints.
Yeah, it's great. Karlijn, what have you found most challenging in terms of measuring your impact?
I think some of the things that is quite challenging is that there's not necessarily a general standards for things. So when we look at life cycle assessments, for example, there are certain standards that are put in place, but it doesn't account for everything, and people can choose a bit or what is included and what not. And for example, plastic pollution in the environment is not accounted for. It's always based on assumptions that the plastic packaging will end up in bins. And so things like leakage in the environment and impact on that pollution then on, for example, marine life and potential carbon cycles are not represented. So that can be sometimes quite challenging, like making a fair comparison or looking at the right things as well, like making sure that we really take account for the things that we should be taking account for. That's really important as well, is that we look at the carbon and carbon equivalents of what is emitted and put into the environment. In that case, we need to make sure that we really fully have a holistic view of that. And I think a similar thing for us counts as well for certifications. There are certain certifications like home composting, and there are certain standards of how that testing is done. We believe not always those standards are as high as they could be. We need to adhere to these standards, but we also see some of the limitations that are in that. Can be quite challenging to navigate that.
What about spreading the word? When you think about working with especially external partners, potential customers, partners, and so forth, how have you approached trying to tell the story of what you're doing, whether that's sharing metrics or individual, anecdotal, human interest sorts of stories. What role does that play in your overall strategy, and how have you gone about doing it?
When looking externally, the whole ecosystem, spreading the word in terms of raising awareness about what we are doing. We are running open calls, which on the one hand is a way to secure prospects, but maybe even more importantly, it's also a way to spread a word about us to the external market. We are also working very closely with other ecosystem players. When it comes to social impact, we truly believe that referrals from qualitative partners is essential to find really good examples, good companies that we could invest in, as not everything is in the books. Paradox given that we are speaking about metrics, but definitely when it comes to social impact, we need also certain mindsets and certain approach, and really willing to hard work on filling in the gaps in the social impact approach by the leaders. Those are the key things that helps us have a qualitative portfolio, hardworking, and on the other hand, to keep this awareness at a high level across the local regional ecosystem.
Yeah, I fully agree with Bragg in terms of the importance of awareness. I think for us internally, what we do is starting with educating ourselves and then using that also to sometimes educate our partners. Like there's a lot of different types of solutions out there, and a lot of people are trying to tackle the plastic problem. And there's a lot of also greenwashing and confusing things out there. So we continue to always educate ourselves and share what we find with partners that we work with. Working with different companies, what we try to find is real champions at those companies that are also driven by impact and could be a champion internally for driving change and doing that together with us. So I think finding those allies is really important. And the same sense of allies, one of the things in terms of policy making and how policies can definitely influence things that we're doing is that policy makers need to be aware that there are some solutions out there, even though we're relatively small compared to the plastics industry. For example, what we started to do is to create a group of allies, other companies that are in a similar space as us and have similar values as us, which we call the Natural Polymers Group, to share that awareness of like, okay, we are a group of companies and you could see us as competitors, but at the same way, we're also allies, all working towards the same mission and same goals. And being able to share that awareness with policymakers is also quite important. And of course, we also have a really amazing communication team internally that always keeps thinking about creative ways and engaging ways of sharing what we're doing and making things clear. That's also a bit of what I was saying before around like the educational piece and how to deal with these complexities. We try to simplify the message and simplify the story so people are engaged and people understand what is happening and are able to make informed decisions.
Especially in challenging economic times, there can be more scrutiny around SDG-focused projects. How does this increased scrutiny raise the stakes for teams to ensure they deliver on their targets so the organization continues to prioritize these efforts?
What is, I think, quite important, and you mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, is that our key metric, of course, we have a lot of different metrics, but our key metrics around replacing as much single-use plastic units as possible is very much linked to also thriving as a business. In terms of the units sold is directly linked to the units that we've replaced. So I think having that linked is very, very helpful in our case. If you're able to show progress that you're making, right, that's what we can show through metrics is how closer we get to our goals and how close we can get to success. But also we can show if we're setting specific metric targets, how good are we at meeting those targets when the times gets tough, or if there's new funding or projects related. There's definitely people look at those metrics to determine if they will invest more, or if they're happy to support us more or work with us. So I think being able to set good targets and being able to reach those targets, but at the same time being quite ambitious, I think that balancing that out is super important, and having metrics that measure, in our case, double things of the impact that we're making, but also how well we're doing as a business in terms of more financially. I think that's really key.
Greg, how about you?
When there is hard times in terms of business performance, social impact could be affected in terms of scale, in terms of quality, depending from company to company. And what we are doing with this is kind of multi-level strategy, which combines, on the one hand, metrics, on the other, diversification, and both things are going hand in hand in terms of communicating and discussing with potential donors, talking through numbers. I mean, showing what kind of impact we are generating thanks to our companies, where we are, what kind of value we are adding, and how it is against the benchmark. If I truly believe numbers are illustrative, especially when talking to business. And on the other hand, when looking at the other side of this chain, I mean, to the companies in the portfolio, we are always setting them some KPIs, some goals, of course, defining them together with them, and then tracking on a quarterly basis, and then at the annual benchmarking, where they are against the short-term goals and against the long-term goals when it comes especially to social impact, to level of salaries, to number of people trained or employed or placed. And accordingly, we are adjusting also the investment structures that we are giving them based on where they are in terms of achieving those goals. So they are incentivized if they are closer to reaching the impact goals, or they have maybe a bit tougher conditions when they are far away or totally not aligned with the impact goals. So I would say that on the one hand, very useful, very supportive for fundraising, using clear and precise metrics. On the other hand, very much supporting the case and the overall portfolio work for the companies when they see goals and clear incentives that comes with achieving or overperforming with the social impact metrics.
What's the biggest lesson each of you have learned from your work on these projects, especially when it comes to measuring your impact?
One key lesson was going outside the bubble, I would say. We usually are working with typical social enterprises, while here in the Refugee Employment Initiative, from the very beginning, we made this decision that if we want to have a big impact, a meaningful impact, we need to also work with more traditional businesses, very much profit-oriented, but those that their workforce consisted from a lot of vulnerable people, especially refugees, migrants. What we learned throughout is speaking very precisely based on numbers and metrics actually with traditional business, profit-oriented, and teach them to progress into the social impact side when it comes to the job conditions, but more importantly, when it also comes to communicating internally and externally to the world that they are doing impact job, even though they were not calling it in this way previously.
One thing that we touched on a little bit is that there's certain benchmarks or metrics that the industry requires, and then there's the view of what you think as a company or as your mission that you want to work towards. One of the things that is learned that is sometimes it's okay to not have those same benchmarks and to find and define those benchmarks a bit more yourself to increase that standard, and then to communicate about that and work with different peoples that believe in the same values as yourself to see how that can one day become maybe the new standard. And I think this is maybe also a bit related to Greg, what you said. Partnerships are really key. One of our values is better together. And I think that's really important to be outward facing and working together with brands and finding ways to make it work. And as you said, Greg, it's not always easy to work with companies that maybe have sometimes a different drive and different agendas and different measures of success, but to find ways to make it work, because in the end, to make the biggest impact that we can make, we do need to work together, and we do need to work with companies that you might not initially have the same values with, but eventually to turn towards ways to make it work for everybody.
Awesome. Thanks very much. And thank you for listening to Projectify. Like what you heard? Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating or review. Your feedback matters a lot. It helps us get the support we need to continue making this show. And be sure to visit us online at pmi.org/podcast, where you'll find the full transcripts for episodes, as well as links to related content like useful tools and templates, the latest research reports, and more. Catch you next time.